There's a specific moment when an avoidant realizes with absolute certainty that your self-respect exceeds their ego in ways that completely demolish their psychological framework and force a reckoning they never anticipated. This moment doesn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It arrives quietly through the accumulation of evidence that you've been operating from a place of genuine self-worth rather than performing confidence while secretly hoping they'll choose you. When this realization lands, everything they thought they understood about themselves, the relationship, and their psychological and superiority disintegrates simultaneously. Understanding the ego versus self-respect dynamic. Before examining what happens when your self-respect defeats their ego, it's crucial to understand the fundamental difference between these two psychological forces and why one always ultimately destroys the other in direct confrontation. Avoidant ego is built on external validation architecture. It requires other people to pursue them, need them, and demonstrate their superiority through behavior that confirms the avoidant's belief that they're the prize in every relationship. This ego is structurally dependent on your inferior position to maintain its elevated status. This means avoidant ego isn't actually strength. It's extreme dependency disguised as superiority. Their ego requires you to be less than them to feel like something. Remove your lesser position, and their ego has nothing to stand on because it was never built on authentic self-worth, but on comparative superiority. Genuine self-respect, by contrast, requires nothing external for its maintenance. It doesn't need them to choose you, validate you, or confirm your worth through their pursuit. It exists independently of their behavior, their opinions, and their emotional availability. It's structurally immune to their manipulation because it doesn't depend on anything they control. This is the fundamental power asymmetry. Their ego needs you to be small, while your self-respect needs nothing from them. This means every move they make to diminish you or maintain their superiority position is like punching air. It has nothing to connect with because you've already secured your foundation internally. The first evidence, how you receive their hot-cold behavior. The first evidence that your self-respect might exceed their ego arrives through your response to their intermittent reinforcement patterns. Avoidants are accustomed to their hot-cold behavior, creating specific responses. Warmth creates hope and pursuit. Coldness creates anxiety and increased effort to restore warmth. This pattern works because it requires your emotional state to be dependent on their temperature. When they're warm, your worth increases in your own estimation. When they're cold, your worth decreases, and you work to restore their warmth because their approval is your primary worth barometer. But something different starts happening when your self-respect is genuine. Their warmth is pleasant, but doesn't create the desperate hope it once did, because your worth doesn't increase based on their attention. Their coldness is unpleasant, but doesn't create the anxiety it once did, because your worth doesn't decrease based on their withdrawal. They start noticing that their primary relationship management tool is producing increasingly inadequate results. Your responses aren't matching their expectations, and this mismatch creates the first genuine uncertainty about whether their usual strategy will work with you. The confusion intensifies as they try variations of their pattern: more intense warmth, colder coldness, longer cycles and discover that none of these adjustments create the predictable responses they need to feel in control. Your emotional stability in the face of their instability begins registering as something they've never encountered before, the moment they test directly. Avoidants rarely test consciously, but their psychology conducts constant assessments of how much power they have over your emotional state. At some point, they create a deliberate test designed to reveal whether your self-respect is genuine or performed. This test takes different forms depending on their style. Some create an obvious slight, a cancellation without adequate explanation, a period of unexplained distance, a comment designed to create insecurity. Some withhold something you need, emotional validation, communication, follow through on plans. Some create direct competition by mentioning other potential romantic interests. Whatever form the test takes, the purpose is identical: to discover whether your self-respect has structural integrity, or whether sufficient pressure reveals the anxious, validation-seeking person underneath the confident presentation. The test is designed to force a choice between your self-respect and your desire for their approval. They're checking whether your self-worth is conditional on their good behavior or unconditional in its nature. When your self-respect is genuine, you respond to their test in ways that reveal its structural integrity. You don't chase after their unexplained distance. You don't anxiously over-explain yourself after their slight. You don't compete for their attention when they mention others. You simply continue being yourself from a place of secure self-knowledge. This response to their test creates the first genuine shock in their system because it doesn't match any pattern their psychology has a protocol for. They've never encountered a test response that wasn't ultimately about seeking their approval or restoring their good opinion. What happens inside them when the test fails? When their test fails to produce the expected response, avoidants experience a psychological disruption that feels like stepping onto expected solid ground and finding nothing there. Their entire mental model of the relationship dynamic suddenly has no foundation. The disruption begins with confusion. Why didn't their tactic work? Is something wrong with them? Have they miscalculated the dynamic? They run through possible explanations, most of which still center on some failure or miscalculation on their part, rather than genuinely considering that your self-respect might be authentic. Their ego's first defense is dismissal. You're pretending, performing confidence to attract their interest, or deliberately suppressing your real reaction. They tell themselves that underneath your composed response is the anxious, wanting person they expect to find. But this dismissal keeps running into evidence that contradicts it. The consistency of your responses across multiple situations, the lack of the tiny tells that accompany performed confidence, the occasional desperate overtone, the slight over-explanation, the strategic proximity, creates accumulating evidence that can't be explained by performance theory. The second defense is reframing. Maybe you simply don't care enough about them to be affected by their tests. This feels safer because it maintains their superiority by suggesting they're not important enough to you, rather than acknowledging you're too secure to be destabilized by them. But this reframing also keeps failing because your warmth toward them is genuine and visible. You clearly care about them, clearly enjoy their company, clearly feel something real in the connection. The combination of genuine caring and genuine self-respect without desperate need is something their psychology has no category for. The accumulation of evidence, weeks to months. What truly shatters avoidant ego isn't a single moment, but the accumulation of evidence over time that your self-respect maintains its structural integrity across all conditions, situations, and tests they consciously and unconsciously administer. They watch you respond to their emotional unavailability with equanimity rather than panic. They see you maintain your own life, interests, and emotional world without organizing everything around their availability. They observe you setting and maintaining limits about what you'll accept without drama or desperation. They notice how you handle compliments, receiving them gracefully without needing them, letting them land without clinging to them as validation. They see how you handle criticism, considering it thoughtfully without devastation, responding from security rather than defensiveness. They observe how you talk about yourself, not with the anxious self-deprecation of someone who needs external confirmation of their worth, not with the overconfident performance of someone trying to convince themselves and others of value they're not sure they possess. Just honest, grounded acknowledgement of who you are. They watch how others treat you and how you respond to that treatment, how naturally you receive respect, how calmly you address disrespect, how little you need people to confirm your value because you've already confirmed it yourself. Each observation adds another data point to a picture that's becoming impossible to explain away. You actually believe in your own worth, not as a strategy, not as performance, not as defensive armor. Actually, structurally, genuinely. The realization landing, the psychological earthquake. There's a specific moment, usually quiet and undramatic from the outside, when the accumulated evidence reaches critical mass and the realization lands completely. Your self-respect is not only genuine, but stronger than their ego. This moment creates what can only be described as a psychological earthquake. The earthquake occurs because this realization doesn't just affect how they see you. It retroactively transforms how they understand themselves. If your self-respect is genuine and stronger than their ego, then their ego isn't the strength they've been presenting it as. Their superiority was never real. It was comparative, dependent on others being smaller. This retroactive transformation means everything they believed about themselves as psychologically strong, independent, and superior has to be fundamentally re-examined. The foundation on which their identity has been built is revealed as sand rather than bedrock. The shaking extends further. If they've been mistaking dependency on others' inferior position for genuine strength, then their entire life narrative needs revision. All the relationships where they maintained comfortable superiority, were those genuine strength or exploitation of people with lower self-worth? The answer is devastating. They're experiencing simultaneous ego death and identity crisis that happens faster and more completely than any gradual personal growth process could create. Your self-respect has accomplished in months what years of therapy might attempt to create. The 3 directions. This realization takes them. When avoidants experience this earthquake, They have three possible directions, and which one they take reveals their fundamental character and psychological readiness for genuine relationship. The first direction is defensive escalation, intensifying their attempts to diminish your self-respect, finding increasingly aggressive or subtle ways to challenge your sense of worth, and making it their psychological mission to prove your confidence is performance rather than reality. This direction reveals profound psychological immaturity and genuine danger in the relationship. Their escalation tactics become more targeted as they discover which approaches come closest to destabilizing you. They're not trying to win you back. They're trying to restore their superior position through your diminishment. This response requires immediate and permanent disengagement on your part. The second direction is genuine collapse. Their ego crumbles completely, and they experience the full devastation of realizing they've been performing superiority to compensate for profound inner inadequacy. This direction is painful to witness, but represents the necessary demolition before genuine rebuilding can occur. Their collapse might manifest as sudden, unusual honesty about their inadequacies, unexpected emotional vulnerability, or the kind of confession that's clearly coming from a place of having their defenses comprehensively dismantled. They're not performing vulnerability to win you. They're genuinely exposed. The third and most important direction is what happens when the earthquake creates space for awakening. They begin moving toward you from an entirely different place, motivated not by ego restoration or manipulation, but by genuine recognition of your value and genuine desire to be worthy of you. This third direction is the one that creates the possibility of something real being built from the rubble of their ego death. What changes in their behavior after the realization? When avoidants experience this realization and move toward authentic response rather than defensive escalation, their behavior undergoes changes that are immediately recognizable as different from their previous patterns. Their communication becomes less calculated and more genuine. Gone are the carefully timed responses designed to maintain mystery and control. They're responding when they want to respond because they're no longer managing your emotional investment through strategic availability. Their questions about you become genuinely curious rather than information gathering for manipulation. They want to understand you, not to find your pressure points or calibrate their approach, but because genuine interest in who you are has replaced their previous preoccupation with managing relationship dynamics. Their presence during difficult moments changes dramatically. Where they previously withdrew when things got emotionally challenging, they start demonstrating a new capacity for remaining present. The withdrawal reflex is still there. You can sometimes see them choosing against it, but they're choosing to stay rather than retreat. They start offering things you never asked for, consideration of your preferences when making plans, follow through on things they said they'd do, small demonstrations of reliability that accumulate in evidence of genuine behavioral change rather than just temporary motivation. Their honesty increases uncomfortably. They start admitting things that make them look bad, acknowledging when they've behaved poorly, recognizing patterns in themselves that they previously denied or minimized. This honesty isn't designed to win your sympathy. It's the natural result of their ego's reduced functioning as a filter between their authentic reality and their presented self. The pursuing dynamic completely reverses. One of the most striking, observable changes when your self-respect defeats their ego is the complete reversal of the relationship's pursuing dynamic. The person who was previously the pursued becomes the pursuer, and this reversal happens without you doing anything to create it. They start initiating contact more frequently than you do. They start making plans rather than waiting to be included. They start expressing interest rather than waiting for you to express it first, and then deciding whether to reciprocate. This pursuit feels entirely different from the desperate pursuit they're used to receiving, which was driven by anxiety about losing their approval. Their new pursuit is driven by genuine desire to be in your presence, to have access to the warmth and clarity your energy provides, and to prove to themselves that they can be someone you continue to choose. The reversal creates interesting psychological territory for you, because you've been trained by their previous behavior to be cautious about their attention. Their pursuit looks like what you've been wanting, but you've learned not to reorganize yourself around it the way you might have before. This caution is healthy and valuable. Your self-respect means you don't immediately adjust your entire emotional life to accommodate their new pursuit. You receive it with warmth, but without abandoning the inner stability you've built. Your continued groundedness in the face of their pursuit deepens their respect and intensifies their investment, because they're experiencing something they've never felt before. Pursuing someone whose self-worth doesn't increase based on being pursued. You're the same person you were when they were ignoring you, which proves your worth was never dependent on their attention. The specific things your self-respect teaches them through the sustained demonstration of self-respect that exceeded their ego. You taught them things that no amount of direct communication or emotional appeal could have conveyed. Your behavior as a living example created education that bypassed all their defenses, because it came through direct experience rather than instruction. You taught them what genuine strength looks like versus performed strength. They spent years believing their emotional unavailability was strength, but watching you navigate difficulty from genuine centeredness while remaining emotionally open revealed that real strength is the ability to feel everything without being destroyed by it. You taught them that being valued highly doesn't require performing low maintenance or mysterious unavailability. Your consistent worth wasn't manufactured through scarcity tactics. It was demonstrated through genuine engagement with life that made you interesting, capable, and developed as a person. They learned value comes from substance. You taught them that emotional intelligence and self-respect aren't in conflict. They've been operating under the unconscious assumption that caring deeply and maintaining self-respect were mutually exclusive. That vulnerability meant losing yourself. Your example destroyed this false dichotomy. You taught them that setting limits from strength is entirely different from setting ultimatums from desperation. When you declined to accept treatment beneath your standards, you weren't threatening them or trying to change them. You were simply being true to yourself. This authenticity was the opposite of the controlling dynamic they'd learned to expect from relationship standards. Most importantly, You taught them that being genuinely loved by someone with real self-worth requires becoming worthy of that love, not through performance or strategy, but through actual character development and emotional growth. This is perhaps the most important lesson they've ever received: the shame and the reckoning. When avoidants truly understand that your self-respect exceeded their ego all along, they experience profound shame about their previous behavior that differs from the surface level guilt they might have felt before this realization. Before understanding this dynamic, any guilt they felt was abstract. They knew they'd behaved poorly, but didn't fully understand the complete picture of what they'd been doing. They saw the surface behaviors, but not the underlying architecture of ego dependency that drove them. With this understanding, their shame becomes specific and comprehensive. They see clearly that they were dependent on your emotional instability for their sense of superiority. They recognize that every time they withdrew to create anxiety, every mixed signal they generated, every test they administered was an attempt to confirm their superior position by producing evidence of your lesser one. They understand that they were essentially exploiting whatever gap existed between their ego and your self-respect, and that their tactics were specifically designed to maintain and widen that gap rather than build genuine connection. This understanding creates deep shame about their fundamental motivations. The reckoning includes recognizing how much energy you expended maintaining your self-respect in the face of their systematic attempts to undermine it. They see the work it required from you, the quiet daily choice to return to your own center rather than reorganize around their emotional availability. This reckoning is productive rather than destructive when it creates motivation for genuine change rather than paralyzing self-condemnation. The avoidant who moves through this shame into accountability is on a completely different trajectory than the one who uses shame as another reason to withdraw. Why they respect you in ways they've never respected anyone. The aftermath of your self-respect defeating their ego creates a profound and unique respect for you that differs from any regard they've had for previous partners. This respect has specific qualities that make it different. It's based on genuine admiration rather than assessment of your usefulness to them. They admire you, and not for what you provide or what you overlook, but for the quality of your character as demonstrated through your behavior under pressure. This is a respect that has nothing to do with what you can give them. It contains genuine humility, which is rare for avoidants whose previous relationships have been structured to maintain their psychological superiority. Respecting you requires acknowledging that you've demonstrated something they hadn't developed themselves, which requires genuine humility about their own limitations. It includes the specific regard one has for someone who didn't let you get away with your worst behavior, not through confrontation or demands, but through the quiet refusal to diminish yourself to maintain connection. This respect includes gratitude for your not participating in their self-destruction. The respect motivates the desire to become worthy of your continued presence, not to win you, not to restore their superior position, but to become someone whose character is genuinely worth your choosing. This motivation is the healthiest thing that could emerge from the entire dynamic. the permanent change in how they see all relationships. Your self-respect, exceeding their ego, doesn't just change how they see you, it permanently alters how they understand relationships and their own patterns within them. They can no longer comfortably maintain their previous framework, where their emotional unavailability equals strength and others' need for connection equals weakness. Your example has revealed this framework as the sophisticated delusion it was. They start recognizing their ego dependency in current and future interactions, noticing when they're seeking others' lesser position to feel strong, when they're creating emotional instability in someone to feel powerful, when they're using someone's need for them to maintain psychological superiority. This recognition is uncomfortable but transformative. They can't unsee what your example helped them see, which means they're unable to return to unconscious operation of their previous patterns. Consciousness doesn't eliminate their avoidant tendencies immediately, but it removes the possibility of comfortable, unconscious indulgence in them. Their standards for what constitutes genuine strength in themselves and others permanently shifts. They start valuing emotional courage, the ability to feel and be vulnerable while remaining grounded in ways they never had before, recognizing it as harder and more impressive than the emotional shutdown they'd previously mistaken for strength. What this means for future possibilities between you. If your self-respect, defeating their ego, has created genuine awakening rather than defensive escalation, it creates a completely different foundation for any potential future between you, one that's built on mutual respect rather than the unhealthy dynamic that previously existed. They're now approaching you from humility rather than entitlement. Instead of expecting you to work for their approval, they understand they're working to be worthy of yours. This role reversal is healthy because both people's worth is now correctly positioned. They're motivated by genuine regard rather than ego management. Their desire to be with you comes from authentic appreciation of who you are rather than the previous mix of ego feeding, fear of replacement, and comfort with your accommodating behavior. They're more capable of emotional honesty because your self-respect has shown them the alternative to performance. Authentic engagement that doesn't require perfect presentation, but asks for genuine presence and accountability. They understand that maintaining this healthier dynamic requires ongoing choice and genuine effort, not the minimal investment they could make when their ego was maintained by your lesser position. The relationship they're now capable of building is built on choosing each other from a place of genuine worth rather than relative superiority. The essential warning: not all awakenings last. The psychological awakening is profound and genuine, but it exists in constant tension with their deeply ingrained defensive patterns that didn't develop in a moment and won't be fully resolved in a moment. The awakening creates new motivation and new awareness, but their nervous system's responses, their withdrawal reflexes, and their ego's attempts to restore its previous comfortable position don't disappear because they've had a psychological earthquake. What makes the difference between an awakening that creates lasting change and one that fades back into previous patterns is whether they pursue genuine healing work, therapy, consistent self-examination, and sustained behavioral effort, or whether they rely on the awakening itself as sufficient transformation. Your self-respect must remain constant throughout their process of genuine change. You cannot adjust your standards downward to accommodate their progress, however genuine, without undermining the very dynamic that created their awakening in the first place. The moment your self-respect becomes conditional, if you lower your limits to reward their effort or expand your availability based on their temporary improvement, you restore the ego's ability to measure itself against your lesser position, and the awakening's power begins eroding. The most important understanding: what makes your self-respect more powerful than their ego isn't dominance, strategy, or game playing. It's authenticity. You can't manufacture self-respect that will defeat avoidant ego through performance, and avoidance can detect performed confidence immediately because their psychology is exquisitely attuned to the difference. Real self-respect that defeats avoidant ego is built through the long, unglamorous work of learning to value yourself in the absence of external validation, learning to be complete in your own company, learning to hold your standards even when maintaining them costs you relationships you want to keep. This self-respect isn't achieved through reading about it or deciding to have it, but through the accumulated practice of treating yourself as someone whose needs matter, whose time is valuable, and whose emotional world deserves protection, especially in moments when someone you love is suggesting otherwise. When your self-respect is genuine and strong enough to exceed avoidant ego, you don't just change one relationship, you potentially change the person, because seeing authentic self-worth demonstrated by someone who also loves them is the most transformative experience possible for someone who built their identity around the false strength of comparative superiority.